So you have backups there, and everybody know that backups is the most basic cybersecurity posture at both at the individual level and at the government and institutional level. But nobody did the backups, and because of that, the ransomware group managed to go in and compromise over 200 government agencies in Indonesia. So I think they learned that if you do challenge China openly, depending on your situation, for the Philippines, you face Chinese pushback both in the kinetic front at the South China Sea as well as on the cyberspace. But for countries like Vietnam and Singapore, we face more pushback from China on the cyberspace.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Faizal, research fellow at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at the RSIS. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you very much. Considering China's constant territorial expansion in the region, why is it that Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore are kind of sitting on a fence? They cooperate both with Western countries and also with China.
That is actually a very interesting question, which many Western observers have been asking me. The thing about Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia is that we are located in Southeast Asia, which is actually a region that neighbors China directly. In that regard, all these three countries have their own individual strategies to deal with this very big neighbor up north. Unlike the European countries or the United States, China is a geographic reality to us. It's just next door. In that regard, it is important at a very broad level to be a good neighbors with China, despite the issues that we have with them. I believe the policy of these three countries, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, is to make sure that the issues of South China Sea does not color or affect the broader bilateral relations between each of these country with China, because besides South China Sea, there are other issues that requires cooperation rather than competition.
Okay, but we do have issues like recently, for example, after very nice and cooperative gestures from Malaysia's Prime Minister, we have an immediate reaction from China demanding recently to immediately halt all activities in an oil rich area of Sarawak waters.
Hmm.
So, what do you think? What would the Malaysian authorities do now?
I think what the Malaysian authorities will try to do now is to perhaps downplay the South China Sea issue, because if we look at the Malaysian government now, especially under the current Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, he is like the perhaps the third or fourth or fifth Prime Minister in the last 5 years. So to him, it is very important for him to ensure that his government continues until perhaps the next election, and that he is not removed from power by some popular uprising or something like that. He has to address the issue of economic problems in the country, economic challenges, and other issues that are very important to the domestic constituency. And because of that, he believes that he needs to work with China for the economic good of his country, even working with Russia, in fact, to look for some economic opportunities. So I think he will focus more on that and try to address the South China Sea issue through back channel diplomacy, or what we call quiet diplomacy, where they discuss with China through dialogues, but without bringing it out to the public to the extent that it may look confrontational or may appear to be a slap in the face of China. But we need to understand that Malaysia has its own way of dealing with China. Perhaps it's different such that other countries in this region, Southeast Asia, and including the Americans, may not totally understand it. I think when it comes to Malaysia, it is firstly their culture. When they have some dispute with another party, they try to handle it in a very tactful way. But that doesn't mean that they will back down from protecting their sovereign rights or even their territorial sovereignty. For many years, Malaysia has never accepted the 9 or 10 dash line of China. In fact, Malaysia has placed military assets in some of the small atolls or islands at the Spratly Islands there. And currently, there are plans for the Malaysian Armed Forces to build a new naval base at the state of Sarawak, which faces the South China Sea, where Chinese militia and coast guards are there. So, in a way, what Malaysia tries to do is that it tries to build up its own military defenses quietly, and to the extent that it is able to do, without openly challenging the Chinese PLA Navy or Coast Guard, because Malaysia can never, challenge the Chinese militarily. And second, I think what Anwar Ibrahim will try to do is that it will try to look for more economic cooperation with China, with the hope of convincing China that the economic cooperation is bigger than South China Sea, so that China will not try to push harder on the South China Sea angle.
Here I have to push back a little because you could say the same thing about all China's neighbors. The same thing with Taiwan, Japan, and recently Philippines. And
Mm,
none of them has been successful. It never works out. They
mhm,
all are connected economically, and they
mm.
all see military advancement from China. So that's why I'm really curious and a bit surprised. Why does Malaysia think it would work out in their case?
Well, if you look at it, if you look at the countries that have an interest or stake in South China Sea, Brunei, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, they all have a stake in South China Sea, but geographically and geostrategically they are quite different. So they have their own ways of dealing with China. They have their own interests. So they try to tailor their approach towards China according to their own interests. None of them have the same approach. Vietnam has their own what we call bamboo diplomacy, where they also do not they try to engage China more through dialogue rather than through confrontational means, or what we call assertive diplomacy, assertive transparency, with the Philippines are doing. Philippines have their own way. I think the Philippines can do what they can do because compared to Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines has less economic dependence or economic connection with China, and they are, after all, a treaty ally of the US, and they do face more challenges from China, so they have to do what they have to do. Whereas for countries like Malaysia and and Vietnam and Indonesia, they also face challenges at South China Sea from China, but not, perhaps not to the extent that the extent of confrontation or physical aggression which the Philippines face. So as long as the dispute with China doesn't cross a certain line, which only the respective countries would know better, I believe Vietnam, Malaysia in particular, and Indonesia will try to maintain what it is doing now, without going all the way out to confront China. It is not in the appetite of Southeast Asian countries to take a very confrontational approach towards China, because, I mean, historically, from my point of view, Southeast Asia has been a bed of conflict in the past, during the colonial era and post-colonial era. So Southeast Asia has spent the last 30 years working hard to make sure that this region is a region, what they call, of a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, and they do not want to compromise that as long as possible. But of course, the situation is quite different from the Philippines. So the Philippines have to do what they have to do. The other countries like Malaysia may not agree with what the Philippines is doing, but each of them are doing what they think is best for their own respective national interests.
This channel is my passion, and yet those videos take time and effort to make. By liking this video, you can help push the ever-hostile algorithm in my favor. I'm very grateful for it.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about Indonesia, another case. They are, for example, cooperating militarily with Australia and the US, and also have exercises planned with China. There is a
Mm.
very interesting article about this issue written by Rahman, and he highlights a lot of issues that Indonesia might run into with regard to the United States. Like, why again are they cooperating, and do they really think that the Western countries would tolerate that? Sell them arms at the same time, see them exercising with China.
Okay, that is a very interesting question about, especially the part when you said that, whether you asked whether Western countries, the US, will tolerate what Indonesia is doing with China. Now the thing is, does is it in Indonesia's interest to care what the Western powers are thinking? Do they need to care how the Western powers are thinking? Because Indonesia, if you look at its history, it had a very difficult history, and there was even a point in time where the Indonesian military, the TNI, some of its leaders were sanctioned by the Western powers like the US. So I think that is probably one episode in the past which they have not forgotten till today. So even today, when Indonesia tried to do more militarily with the Western powers like the US, for example, through like the some of the military exercises like Super Garuda Shield, it is definitely for mutual interest, but that doesn't mean that the Indonesians forgot what the US did in the past to sanction its military leaders. So there is no guarantee that in the coming years, the US may not impose similar sanctions on Indonesia. So that is why I would say that Indonesia tries to have a diversity of military partners or friends besides the US. But we have to understand that the scale and sophistication of the activities that the Indonesia does with the US and China are different. I think the bilateral exercise Super Garuda Shield between Indonesia and the US, which also involves observers or participants from the other countries except China, is pretty well established, very substantive, and quite sophisticated. Whereas when it comes to doing exercises with China, I believe it is more for just to maintain a warm relation. It's more symbolic, but by doing that, I think Indonesia also want to demonstrate that as much as it has concerns about the Chinese hegemony in this region, as much as Indonesia has concern about Chinese activities near its Natuna Islands, Indonesia is very proud of its bebas aktif of a free and independent foreign policy. It wants to demonstrate that what it does is according to its own national interests, not according to the Chinese interests, Beijing interests, or American interests. So I believe that by when Pak Prabowo went to Beijing after he won his election, it is trying to tell the Beijing that uh, we that Jakarta sees Beijing as an important partner. They do not want any conflict with Beijing, but at the same time, I think they want to tell the Americans that Indonesia has a choice. It is independent. We have common interests, but that doesn't mean that American interests are Indonesia interests. 100%. There are some similarities that they can work together, but there are some areas which they may or may not agree.
That's a great point. The last country I would like to ask you about is Singapore, which is also in a similar situation. It's actually very pro-American militarily, but cooperates with China. Here I wanted to ask you about the elite capture, because I know there is a lot of Chinese influence and propaganda in Singapore, and especially I'm referring to the Washington Post article from July last year about Lianhe Zaobao. So how does the situation look like in Singapore?
The Lianhe Zaobao issue that was raised by Washington Post is a very interesting. Lianhe Zaobao, the local Chinese newspaper in Singapore, disagreed with what Washington Post wrote. I think we need to take the whole issue with a bit of a pinch of salt. I do not disagree that there are some Chinese influence in Lianhe Zaobao, especially since Lianhe Zaobao, they have a big readership in China, so they do need to cater their product to the Chinese market and therefore receive some Chinese input. But perhaps the Washington Post may have sort of exaggerate a bit on this issue. But that being said, that doesn't mean that Lianhe Zaobao is immune from foreign Chinese influence. I suspect that Lianhe Zaobao, I mean, they want to penetrate the Chinese market for profit purpose, of course. I mean, it is a business, and it does have internal mechanisms to ensure like some sort of editorial integrity, but that doesn't mean that it is foolproof, and it doesn't mean that they have full control of the situation, because you may be interested in journalistic and profit as a media company. You are not interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics will be interested in you. So I think this is the area where Liang He Jiabao tried to do its best, but there are certain things which they just cannot cannot counter in terms of foreign influence. That being said, it is true that Lianhe Zaobao has been some sort of a vector for foreign influence by China because, um, in Singapore, 2 years ago, 1 to 2 years ago, the government actually passed a new legislation called the Counter Foreign Interference Act, or FICA for short. This act is meant to counter various kinds of foreign interference. It's supposed to be quite a powerful legislation. And early this year, it actually was the law was actually used to sort of sanction one naturalized Singaporean. Uh, this naturalized Singaporean, I shall not name his, I shall not mention his name. He actually came from Hong Kong, I think, about 20 years ago. Then he set up a business here. He became a very successful businessman. He obtained Singaporean nationality, and he became very active because he's a successful businessman. He became very active at what we call the grassroots levels, participating in some of the activities where there are political leaders present. And the thing is, it was discovered that he had actually been participating in some of the CCP activities in China. He's actually can be said that he can be said to be an external or a foreign member of the Chinese Communist Party. It was discovered, and he did publish certain commentaries which are aligned with Chinese views. And he published these commentaries on Lianhe Zaobao. So I guess that is probably one way, one reason why Lianhe Zaobao was highlighted as a vector of foreign influence. But then again, Lianhe Zaobao also have quite an open policy, so it can't actually say no to this guy doing it. But it shows, because this guy was eventually sanctioned by the Singapore government, although the Singapore government did not mention who he was working for. But I think some of the local media, like the Straits Times, did some investigative journalism and found out that he does had have connections to Beijing. So that is one case study we can talk about. So I mean, so Lianhe Zaobao is definitely in the radar, but that doesn't mean they willingly cooperate with Chinese element to spread Chinese influence.
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting nuance. The second part of the interview, I wanted to ask you another question. This one is related to the cybersecurity issues. I know you
Ah,
participate in a lot of events, and so how serious do you think are the threats for China's neighbors, and what can the ASEAN countries do?
China's neighbors is actually quite a big region. I mean, if we look at the Northeast Asia, is neighbors comprised of South Korea and Japan, and further down is of course Southeast Asia. Um, I think when it comes to South Korea and Japan, the level of cyber threat there is actually pretty high. Not just because it's coming from China. In a way, it is coming from some Chinese link actors. I emphasize Chinese link actors because not every malicious cyber activity is linked to the Chinese institution or agency. It can be linked. It may have been conducted by proxy actors or even nationalistic hackers from China. The thing about South Korea and Japan is that they are allies of China, and they are part of allies of the United States. My
Yeah.
apologies. And they are also part of what the Americans call the Chip 4 alliance, the alliance to basically counter China from doing advancing in the semiconductor industry. So I would say that Chinese linked cyber actors have more reasons to target persons and entities in South Korea and Japan. For Southeast Asia, the main reason why the threat level is very serious because this region is becoming more digitalized. It is becoming more digitalized because there's more internet penetration, and the countries in Southeast Asia want to use the digital means to boost its economy, using digital means to integrate the various economies of Southeast Asia. However, the level of cybersecurity posture in this region is not consistent. For some countries like Singapore is higher, Malaysia is also quite high, but for some other countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos is lower. So even though if Singapore has a high level of cybersecurity posture, if the threat comes from Indonesia into Singapore, then Singapore will also be affected. The other thing is that Southeast Asia is, especially like Singapore, it is like a hub, a hub of international trade. And some believe that that makes this region, including Singapore, a place where a lot of covert activities happen. Like some people used to say that was how it was in Hong Kong, that was how it was in Switzerland. So, and you have American interests, Western interests in this region, you have Chinese interests in this region. So naturally, a lot of some of the covert intelligence activities do pass through this region, and into this context is also through the cyber means. So what the region in Southeast Asia tries to do in particular is that um, it has been trying to beef up the cybersecurity knowledge and capacity of the various countries, both in terms of legislature, in terms of technical capabilities by setting up the computer emergency response teams, at the various countries. But it is a very long journey to go, because one main reason is that talent. Not every country has enough human resources to build up an effective cybersecurity workforce. Um, and second is also about the mindset. Although uh, certain technical means have been taken, but the weakest thing is always human beings. Case in point is this very interesting incident that happened in Indonesia in June 2024, this year. So the Indonesian government has engaged a service provider to provide, servers to do backups for the government digital services. So you have backups there, and everybody know that backups is the most basic cybersecurity posture at both at the individual level and at the government and institutional level. But nobody did the backups, and because of that, the ransomware group managed to go in and compromise over 200 government agencies in Indonesia. So the cybersecurity tools are there, but the people are not using it. So you know what I mean?
Dear Studio Asian, if you've gotten that far and not commented nor liked, shame on you. Also sub for more Studio Asia.
It's not such a big danger. It's more for the, let's say, allies or partners of the United States. That's a bigger danger for them, yes?
Exactly. So the situation. I mean, the situation from varies from one country to one country in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, I think most of the countries here are not adversaries of China. Okay, so if you're talking about cyber threats from China, there is less reason for China to conduct malicious activities on Southeast Asia countries. Perhaps Philippines now, because Philippines is the most confrontational, and it's quite clear that ever since Philippines adopted an assertive transparency approach to the South China Sea, the level of malicious cyber attacks on Filipino targets have increased. The level of disinformation attacks on the Philippines have increased. But it's not necessarily the same for the other Southeast Asian countries. It depends on the geopolitics. I believe that is probably one reason why countries in Southeast Asia decided to take a more diplomatic stance towards China, because if you remember from the 2016 ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration about South China Sea, when that happened, Philippines won the case, of course. Singapore was very supportive of the Philippines because Singapore supports the international rules-based order. Vietnam, because of its own interests, also support, although quite quietly, the Philippines' victory at the international court. But what happened? Singapore actually faced quite a number of serious cyber attacks from 2016 to 2018. And although the government didn't actually disclose who was the responsible for it, but they did say it was done by a sophisticated state actor. And it is strongly believed that China actors were involved. The Vietnam too, although they didn't strongly or very vocally support the Philippines, but they did say that they respect the ruling of the Court of Arbitration. And what happened? Airlines websites were attacked. The two airports websites were attacked to sort of challenge the Vietnamese narrative of South China Sea. So I think they learned that if you do challenge China openly, depending on your situation, for the Philippines, not only you face Chinese pushback both in the kinetic front at the South China Sea as well as on the cyberspace. But for countries like Vietnam and Singapore, we face more pushback from China on the cyberspace. So it depends on what's happening in this region, both in terms internally, in terms of the level of security readiness, as well as what is the current geopolitical realities happening out there.
Faisal, thank you very much for your time and for your insights. Really interesting.
Thank you.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.